What do you do with a dead God? If God is dead, if we can no longer believe in him with that same sincere, naive faith of previous generations, where do you go forward from there? Because according to Friedrich Nietzsche, this is not good news. Nietzsche calls it a catastrophe. Without God, the universe is a picture of chaos. In our world, suffering predominates. With God, we at least had the hope that the suffering of this world led to an eternity of joy in the next world. But with the death of God, that option is gone. So what do you do? The most common answer is to reject both desire and suffering. Existence is a bad deal, the thinking goes, so refuse to play the game. Try to achieve some sort of nirvana. No suffering, no desire, no self, just release. That is the answer given by the Stoics, the Buddhists, and Arthur Schopenhauer. But Nietzsche gave a different answer. Quote, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water could we clean ourselves? Is the magnitude of this deed not too great for us? And then the next sentence here is the key. Here is Nietzsche's answer for what we do next. Do we not ourselves have to become gods merely to appear worthy of it? Whatever else you think of Nietzsche, no one can accuse him of lacking ambition. So today we talk about how to become a superhuman, a man strong enough to take the place of God.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
This was our tiny tower.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. On this part 2 on the life and philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, we will talk about the ubermensch, the superhuman. We'll also talk about the will to power and the last man. And by the way, this word, ubermensch, was historically usually translated as Superman. All right. This was made a little bit awkward by the creation of the famous comic book character, Superman. So some people render it Overman, the Beyond Man, or the Superhuman. And I just like the Superhuman. I kind of like the Superman. It doesn't bother me too much. I don't think of the guy in the cape with the red Speedo. But I like Superhuman because, I don't know, it helps to me convey exactly what Nietzsche is trying to express. I think it's actually the best expression, so that's the phrase I'm going to use, the superhuman. But it's the same thing, Superman, superhuman, the Ubermensch is the word in German. We'll also talk about the closest thing that Nietzsche had to a single overarching theme throughout his work, which is the will to power. And we'll talk about what happens in Nietzsche's mind if man does not evolve and embrace the superhuman, which he calls the last man. Once again, before we get started, even if you don't believe in the death of God and you don't buy Nietzsche's entire system of philosophy, I still think that his description of the superhuman and what it means to transcend, to overcome, and to be noble is very valuable. We have a certain view of what it means to be a great man, and Nietzsche comes in and blows it up. And even if you don't totally agree with it, I think the thought experiment alone can help to improve the way you live. So let's get into it. This is Nietzsche and the superhuman. When Wagner was at his cultural ascendancy, he created something called the Bayreuth Festival, and he tried to set it up in this little town, Bayreuth in Germany, as the hub of musical and artistic innovation in Germany. Well, in much the same way, Shockworks has created the Austin AI Lab to serve as a hub for AI innovation in the United States, especially in Texas. Basically, if you are a mid-market to large enterprise business, and you've just been wondering, all right, I know that AI is important, how do we actually implement this in our workflows and drive efficiencies, cost savings, or drive more revenue with it? The Austin AI Lab by Shockworks can come in, help you figure that out, and help you implement it in your business. So if you've been wondering, how do I get started? This seems so big. Give them a call and let them know that I sent you. They're huge supporters of How to Take Over the World, and you won't regret working with them. You can learn more and get in touch at austinlab.ai. Again, that is austinlab.ai. All right, so let's get back into the biography a little bit. Last time we saw Nietzsche, he was a professor of philology in Basel in Switzerland. He begins his professorship at the age of 24 years old in 1869, and he would be a professor in Basel for 10 years. He publishes The Birth of Tragedy and a collection of essays entitled Untimely Meditations. And then in 1878, he publishes his first work of philosophy entitled Human All Too Human. Remember, he's a philologist, but Human All Too Human is his first work of actual philosophy. And All Too Human, really, it's his first philosophical work, but the bulk of his philosophy is there from the very beginning. Of course, this isn't the work of a good philologist, and he's supposed to stay confined to his area of expertise. He's not supposed to range everywhere, encompass everything, and try and work out a sort of universal philosophy. And so, of course, this is going to cause tension for his academic career. I had also mentioned that he had started falling out with Wagner. This happened for a few reasons. One was Wagner's increasing turn toward nationalism and anti-Semitism. Nietzsche strongly dislikes both of these things, but for the opposite reasons that they are typically disliked today. People who oppose nationalism today typically do so because they view it as violent and oppressive toward people who don't belong to that nation. Here's what Nietzsche writes about nationalism in Human All Too Human. He says, quote, "Commerce and industry, traffic in books and letters, the commonality of all higher culture, quick changes of locality and landscape, the present-day nomadic life of all non-landowners, these conditions necessarily bring about a weakening and ultimately a destruction of nations, or at least of European nations, so that a mixed race, that of the European man, has to originate out of all of them as a result of continual crossbreeding. The isolation of nations due to engendered national hostilities now works against this goal, consciously or unconsciously, but the mixing process goes on slowly nevertheless, despite those intermittent countercurrents. This artificial nationalism, by the way, is as dangerous as artificial Catholicism was, for it is in essence a forcible state of emergency and martial law imposed by the few on the many, and requiring cunning, lies, and force to remain respectable. It is not the self-interest of the many, the people, as one would have it, that urges this nationalism, but primarily the self-interest of certain royal dynasties, as well as that of certain commercial and social classes. Once a man has understood this, he should be undaunted in presenting himself as a good European and should work actively on the merging of nations." Okay, so the economic integration of Europe is naturally leading away from nations and nationalism and toward a pan-European transnational project. And nationalism is just a way for some old aristocracies and economic interests to retain their interests and privileges. So it's not your warm, cuddly reasons for opposing nationalism. In Beyond Good and Evil, he states bluntly that German nationalism stands in the way of, quote, "the European problem as I understand it, on the breeding of a new ruling caste for Europe." All right. That is his great project, is to breed this new pan-European aristocracy, this ruling caste. And he thinks that nationalism kind of props up the lower orders. You know, if you're a German nationalist, a French nationalist, an English nationalist, that doesn't just mean the best of your nation, the highest types, the most intelligent, the most beautiful, the strongest. No, nationalism means propping up everyone within a nation, including the unwashed masses. So he opposes that. He wants to form a pan-European aristocracy. Similarly, he opposes anti-Semitism for his own reasons. He has many nice things to say about the Jews, also many not nice things. He quotes Tacitus, who calls them a people born for slavery, and says that with them, the slave revolt of morals began. In All Too Human, he says, perhaps the youthful Jew of the stock exchange is the most repugnant invention of the whole human race. All right? So from that, you're getting anti-Semitic vibes, right? On balance, though, Nietzsche actually has far more positive things to say about Jews than negative things. He says that they are the purest race in Europe, that they're the most intelligent. The only reason people hate them is out of envy and jealousy. But that isn't why he opposes anti-Semitism. It's not because, hey guys, be nice, we should love everyone, kumbaya. It's because it is anti-Semitism is an irrational expression of resentment. And his basic feeling toward the anti-Semite is, look, I would be fine if you looked down on Jews or on anyone because you felt yourself superior to them. But that isn't what anti-Semitism is. You hate them not because you feel superior, but because you feel inferior. It is a movement born of resentment. It is these European people in their own countries that are looking at the Jews who are more educated, more prosperous, higher, better outcomes in general, and that they're resentful that these foreigners can come into their country and achieve more, right? It's resentment. He actually lays out this whole thinking quite clearly in All Too Human. He writes, incidentally, the whole problem of the Jews exists only within national states, inasmuch as their energy and higher intelligence, their capital of spirit and will, which accumulated from generation to generation in the long school of their suffering, must predominate to a degree that awakens envy and hatred. And so, in the literature of nearly all present-day nations, and in fact, in proportion to their renewed nationalistic behavior, there is an increase in the literary misconduct that leads the Jews to the slaughterhouse, as scapegoats for every possible public and private misfortune. As soon as it is no longer a matter of preserving nations, but rather of producing the strongest possible mixed European race, the Jew becomes as useful and desirable an ingredient as any other national quality. Every nation, every man has disagreeable, even dangerous characteristics. It is cruel to demand that the Jew should be an exception. Those characteristics may even be especially dangerous and frightful in him, and perhaps the youthful Jew of the stock exchange is the most repugnant invention of the whole human race. Nevertheless, I would like to know how much one must excuse in the overall accounting of a people which, not without guilt on all our parts, has had the most sorrowful history of all peoples, and to whom we owe the noblest human being, Christ, the purest philosopher, Spinoza, the mightiest book, and the most effective moral code in the world. Furthermore, in the darkest medieval times when the Asiatic cloud had settled heavily over Europe, it was the Jewish freethinkers, scholars, and doctors who, under the harshest personal pressure, held fast to the banner of enlightenment and intellectual independence and defended Europe against Asia. We owe to their efforts not least that a more natural, rational, and in any event unmythical explanation of the world could finally triumph again, and that the ring of culture, which now links us to the enlightenment of Greco-Roman antiquity, remained unbroken. If Christianity did everything possible to orientalize the Occident, then Judaism helped substantially to occidentalize it again and again, which in a certain sense is to say that it made Europe's history and task into a continuation of the Greek. Okay, there was a lot there. By the way, that last statement is true to the present day. You can see it, for example, by visiting the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. J. Paul Getty was a Jewish oil man and billionaire, and he had an obsession with the world of classical antiquity. And he has probably the greatest private collection of Greek and Roman antiques in the world. And so you can go see that in LA. It's worth seeing. And this is not uncommon. Many Jewish businessmen, scholars, and philanthropists have done much to revive interest in the classical world. And so to Nietzsche, this is like the irony of the Jewish nation, that they bring slave morality to Europe via Christianity, but then once Christianity takes hold, because they don't want to assimilate to the majority, they have this curiosity, this drive to explore, this independence of thought, and so they keep rediscovering and resurfacing the classical world. And so they both bring slave morality to Europe and then also like try and save Europe from it to a certain extent. Okay, but so point is, Nietzsche is upset that Wagner is turning toward what he considers crude nationalism, anti-Semitism, and Christianity. In his biography of Nietzsche, H.L. Mencken chalks this up to a big misunderstanding. He basically says that Nietzsche was a philosopher and was above all dedicated to the truth, and for that reason rejected Christianity entirely. But, he writes, Wagner was an artist, not a philosopher. Right or wrong, Christianity was beautiful, and as a thing of beauty, it called aloud to him. To Nietzsche, beauty seemed a mere phase of truth. All right, and this really emerges when Wagner writes an opera called Parsifal, and Parsifal is about the quest for the Holy Grail and has a lot of Christian themes. And to Nietzsche, this is a betrayal of everything that they had been working on. Like, what are we doing here? I thought that we were together on this whole, Hellenism revival thing, and now you're going back to Christianity, all right? And also Nietzsche thought that their whole movement was supposed to be about finding the best in mankind and elevating it. And here Wagner is amplifying the resentment of the many with anti-Semitism, the interests of the unwashed masses with nationalism, and the morality that attacks the very best with Christianity. So Nietzsche slowly starts distancing himself from Wagner. Supposedly, there's a big blow-up one day when Nietzsche is staying with the Wagners in their house. Wagner absolutely hated the German composer Brahms for musical reasons. They didn't have anything personal, I don't think. And Nietzsche knows this and brings some Brahms sheet music to the Wagner's house and keeps playing it and keeps leaving the music on the piano. And Wagner, every time he comes in and he sees this music laying there, he tears it and throws it on the ground. And then Nietzsche will come back later and pick it up and put it back on the piano. And then eventually this leads to a blow-up where Wagner screams in Nietzsche's face. We don't know for sure if this story is true. And in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche writes of Wagner, quote, "Over us no cloud ever passed." So who knows? But what we do know is that intellectually and socially, at least, Nietzsche and Wagner parted ways, leading up to the last couple of years of Nietzsche's career. In fact, the very last, or one of the last things that he writes is an essay entitled anti-Wagner or against Wagner. So there is like a huge parting of ways. Intellectually, they had sort of been fellow travelers, but no more. Around the same time, Nietzsche parts ways with the University of Basel as well. So in 1879, Nietzsche is 34 years old. He has been at Basel for 10 years, and he resigns his professorship, citing his poor health. He had been suffering from severe migraines, digestive issues, and other related illnesses. His eyesight, when he got these terrible headaches, he wouldn't be able to see, like could barely, almost blind. So he's got all these ailments going on. And that had been happening for years, but it was getting worse and worse. So he resigns, and he receives a pension from the University of Basel, which would allow him to live independently without having to work for the rest of his life. Pretty nice, just steady income. So after Basel, he sort of wanders around Switzerland, southern France, and Italy, living in boarding houses and spa towns. He's staying in these places often to try to find a cure for his health. These spa towns, he's taking in the waters, going and trying various cures and stuff like that. He had served as a medical orderly very briefly in the Franco-Prussian War, and for that reason, he kind of thought of himself as a medical expert. And his cure for these ailments was a vigorous daily walk. He walked and hiked constantly. He really pushed his body physically. And the consensus among his biographers is that this was counterproductive. For example, if you read the biography by R.J. Hollingdale, he thinks that Nietzsche was making himself worse by not resting. I think I disagree. Although who knows if this was making him better or worse. We know so little about his actual underlying condition, what was happening in his body. But I will say there are very few ailments that are not made better by being in good shape, right? And Nietzsche does eventually die of a brain ailment, probably the same one that his father died of, but he does live decades longer than his father. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe that his intense regimen of daily exercise is at least partially to explain for his longer life. Anyway, Nietzsche is quite solitary during this time. He often lives in boarding houses where he doesn't really know anyone else. He often spends extended periods of time in Italy during the winters where he doesn't even really know the language, so he isn't able to communicate with the villagers of these towns where he's staying. And he does learn to pick up, of course, a few phrases in Italian, but he never speaks Italian very fluently. So he does have this very independent, often solitary life. However, it's not correct to think of him as a total loner. He punctuates these long periods of solitude with periods of conviviality. He'll, travel to Germany or Austria or Paris to be with friends, share ideas, collaborate, feel like a human again. His closest friends were first Paul Rie, a Jewish German academic who was an important sounding board. It was Paul Rie who introduced Nietzsche to Luz Salome, a very intelligent Russian-born woman who Nietzsche fell hard for and pursued, not realizing that his friend Paul Rie, was actually already involved with this woman, with Salome. In the end, Paul Rie and Salome ran off to Paris together, leaving Nietzsche feeling spurned. And that was kind of a low moment in his life, something you'll hear a lot about if you hear anything about his biography. Another close friend was Erwin Rohde, a fellow philologist, honestly less of a friend and more of Nietzsche's first acolyte. R.J. Hollingdale suggests that Rohde may have actually been in love with Nietzsche, but he served as an important, sometimes friend, sometimes lackey to help Nietzsche get things done. There was also Peter Gast, a pretty well-known composer, and Franz Overbeck and George Brandes, who the last of whom was the first ever professor to lecture on Nietzsche's philosophy and the only one to do so while Nietzsche was still alive. But okay, so that's his inner core of friends, along with Wagner and his wife Cosima, who he's very close with. Okay, so Nietzsche is living in these little Swiss and Italian towns seasonally, and then going and meeting up with friends for a few weeks or maybe a couple months at a time in Venice or Paris or Leipzig or wherever. In 1882, he published The Gay Science, which I think is one of his best books, which introduces the idea that God is dead and continues his philosophy from All Too Human. Between 1883 and 1885, he publishes Thus Spake Zarathustra, which Nietzsche considered to be his masterpiece. It's a work of philosophical fiction where the protagonist is the philosopher and prophet Zarathustra, or in other words, Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism. He was a Persian who lived around 600 BC, and he founded one of the very first monotheistic religions. And Zarathustra is, frankly, a very thinly veiled stand-in for Nietzsche himself, and he goes around philosophizing in this style that is honestly quite scriptural. It reads like ancient scripture, and I do think that Nietzsche intended for Thus Spake Zarathustra to be his response to the Bible. And none of these books, by the way, they all have moderate impact. Nietzsche is well regarded in academic circles, but none of them are popular. None of them are bestsellers. He's not like getting rich off of his books or anything like that. Mostly they're very niche books for people who are interested in this kind of thing. So he's 40 years old. He's living independently. He's basically living off his pension. He's not making money off his books, but he is rapidly developing his philosophy. And as his health rapidly deteriorates here in the late 1880s, paradoxically, his literary activity actually increases. So in 1886, he published Beyond Good and Evil. In 1887, he published On the Genealogy of Morals. And in 1888, his last lucid year before he goes insane, he wrote The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and Nietzsche contra Wagner. In January of 1889, he suffered some sort of mental break. He began acting erratically, swinging wildly from moments of euphoria and mania to absolute dejection and depression. He begins making these ominous prophetic statements, signing letters as either Dionysus or the Crucified. And it's interesting because his madness clearly was progressive. It started before this final break in 1889, and yet this is some of his best writing. Not after. After he has his mental break, he writes nothing. But just before, he's clearly starting to go insane, and yet, the philosophy in these works is great, is very clear, is clearer than ever before. There are some things that you can pick up on, and some of them are kind of obvious, but some people like to suggest that, he's going crazy during this time, and so therefore he is putting forth a crazy philosophy. He's putting forward stuff that is unbelievable. But actually, it's a very clear continuation with his previous philosophy. There's no break or real change in later years. And it's well written, it's well thought out, logically it makes sense, it has a logical progression. This isn't the kind of philosophy that you'd expect from a crazy person, nor is it the kind of philosophy that makes one go mad. And the writing is quite good. So this presents a conundrum because you wonder, with some of these works, what is an intentional style and what is early onset madness? So for example, in his autobiography, Ecce Homo, this is his, it's a cool book. Actually, if you want to get into Nietzsche, this is the first thing I would read. It's very readable. It's his autobiography. It tells about his life. And then he goes through each of his major works and kind of reviews his own work and tells you basically what you should learn from it, what the major themes are. So it's a very accessible introduction into Nietzsche. But in this autobiography, here are the titles of the chapters. Chapter 1, Why I Am So Wise. Chapter 2, Why I Am So Clever. Chapter 3, Why I Write Such Good Books. Chapter 4, Why I Am a Destiny. Okay? Those are the chapters that he puts in Ecce Homo. And in the beginning section, he writes, quote, I am of a lineage which will make me the opposite of everything that today is considered noble, or even comparable to it. I am so noble that the present-day German Kaiser would not be fit to serve as my lackey. Okay? So, on the one hand, you can say, all right, this is a man clearly going mad. He's having delusions of grandeur. He's writing these unbelievable titles. He's saying that he's more noble than the German Kaiser. On the other hand, though, I was laughing hysterically when I first read through Ecce Homo. When I read these chapter titles and when I read that sentence, I thought this is hilarious. And to me, when you read it, you don't feel like you're laughing at a crazy person. It feels like this is intentional. At the very least, kind of tongue-in-cheek. He is sort of poking fun at the whole idea of an autobiography, right? Oh, I'm supposed to be saying how great I am. That's the point of an autobiography, right? Okay, well, then I'll just title the chapters, why I'm so clever, why I'm so wise, why I write such good books, why I'm a destiny. And, if you look at his actual background, it's not noble. It's mostly middle class. It has all of these pastors and ministers, and that's like the middle class profession in Germany, right? So there's nothing really noble about it in actuality. It is kind of a joke what he says, I think. Though again, like he is starting to go crazy when he writes this, so who knows how much. And by the way, before I move on from this mental break, I should address the fact that you often hear the story that Nietzsche has this incident that causes the mental break, which is he sees a man beating a horse in Turin, and he runs up and grabs the horse, holds onto it, shields the horse, and holds the horse and cries, "I understand you, I understand you." And the man who is beating the horse accidentally keeps hitting it when Nietzsche grabs the horse and whips Nietzsche, and he collapses and then goes crazy after that. It's a great story. I think it's almost certainly not true. Nietzsche had his collapse in 1889, and his friend Franz Overbeck comes to Turin in northern Italy to collect him and bring him home to Germany. And Overbeck writes down this story only 6 years later. He says he never saw it. He only heard of it from the landlord with whom Nietzsche was staying. And look, that's actually not the worst chain of custody in the world. Overbeck was physically there on premise to get him. He is an academic. He's an upstanding person. He wasn't a liar. And he does say that he heard this story from the landlord. So it could have happened. However, the biggest piece of evidence against it actually happening is that the incident perfectly mirrors a passage from Crime and Punishment, where Dostoevsky writes about a crowd of peasants cheering on a man as he beats an old mare to death until this character, Raskolnikov, comes and throws himself on the horse, weeping and trying to protect it. And the man keeps hitting the horse and keeps hitting and beats Raskolnikov as he's holding the horse. Okay. I guess actually that evidence could go either way, right? Because we know that Nietzsche read Dostoevsky and respected him immensely. He called him the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn. So I guess it is possible that Nietzsche, having read Crime and Punishment, had this scene in his mind, and then he sees a man beating this horse, and he reflexively acts out the scene that he had read about. So actually, as I'm saying this, I guess maybe I am convincing myself once again that it is plausible that maybe the horse incident did happen. Anyways, I'm getting too much into speculation. Whether this horse scene ever actually occurred or not, Nietzsche did suffer a huge mental break in 1889. As I said, he begins writing a constant stream of delusional letters, either signed as Dionysus or the Crucified. He writes to his friend Peter Gast, quote, "To my maestro Pietro, sing me a new song. The world is transfigured and all the heavens rejoice. The Crucified." To George Brandes, he writes, "After you had discovered me, it was not difficult to find me. The difficulty now is to lose me. The Crucified." And keep in mind, this is all he writes in the letters, right? And he doesn't, this is all, he signs them. So at first, these people don't even know they're from Nietzsche. This is so, you just get a letter in the mail that says, "After you had discovered me, it was not difficult to find me. The difficulty now is to lose me. The Crucified." What do you think when you receive that letter? It's very odd. And it's not all crazy, though, is the thing. There are traces of his old self mixed with this clear delusional break. And sometimes they come together in sort of interesting ways where he's sort of presenting rationales for his delusional imaginations. So, for example, he writes to Burckhardt, "In the last resort, I would much rather have been a professor at Basel than God. But I did not dare to carry my private egoism so far as to neglect the creation of the world on its account." Okay. So he's saying, I would have rather just been a professor than becoming God, which is what has happened to me. I am God. But, I'm not going to let my ego stand in the way of becoming what I'm supposed to be, which is God. I don't have so much ego that I would not become God. He goes on, "You see, one must make sacrifices, however and whenever one lives. I walk around in my student's coat, slap this or that man on the shoulder and say, 'Are we happy? I am God. I have made this caricature. There is magic from time to time. I have had Caiaphas put in chains, and last year I was crucified by the German doctors in a very long drawn-out matter. Wilhelm Bismarck and all anti-Semites abolished. You can make any use of this letter that will not lower me in the esteem of the people of Basel.'" All right. So you see him going from by the way, I'm God, and I've condescended to people, and can you believe it? I would have rather been a professor, but instead I'm God. And by the way, having some good victories against the anti-Semites. This letter, by the way, you can use it and show it to other people if you don't think it'll lower my esteem with the people of Basel. It's very erratic. He also is this way in public, so he starts making scenes in public. He has nervous breakdowns. Things start to go downhill very fast. Overbeck, his friend, takes him to Basel, where he quickly realizes that Nietzsche is not going to be able to live independently. So from there, he goes to Naumburg to live with his mother and his sister. That is to say, Nietzsche's mother and sister. Nietzsche is quiet and docile in the company of others, but as soon as he gets away, he begins yelling and wildly gesticulating. In one incident, he begins to undress on the street when his mother takes her eyes off him for a few minutes. His condition gets worse and worse. He would have moments of lucidity, and that gave his family and friends hope that he might be cured, he might come out of it. But as time goes on, these moments become fewer and fewer until hope was given up for his eventual recovery in 1892. That's basically when they permanently institutionalize him. His mother's only concern was, let me take care of him. I don't want to see him in an institution, in a mental asylum. And so she does. She takes care of him. And it is this very affecting and moving scene that Nietzsche would not have wanted us to think too much about. He hated the emotion of pity. But I must dwell for a second on this very moving scene of this man who was a warrior against his time, right? This independent philosopher who valued above everything else his independence of mind. And he just completely loses that. He becomes like a child again and just follows his mother around. Yes, ma'am, does whatever she says, and she takes care of him. And she thought that it was a blessing that Christ was like recovering Nietzsche's soul. That he had become, he wrote a book called The Antichrist. He was Antichrist. And his father and his father's father and his mother's father and like all these ancestors were ministers. She was very devout, very religious. And so she thought that Christ was recovering him for her sake and for his sake, like striking him with this illness so that once again he would believe his mother, believe in her and follow her and return to like a Christian life in a simple way. I think Nietzsche, in a weird way, would have liked that explanation, right? Like, oh, I am insane, docile, stupid beyond belief. I have no mind. Yes, I'm a perfect Christian. He would have accepted that explanation from his mother. At the same time, in some ways, the madness at the end of his life helps to create the mythos, the mystique of Friedrich Nietzsche. This is the time, the 1890s, early 1900s. This is the time of Bram Stoker's Dracula and Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The idea of a philosopher who discovers things that drive him mad is very romantic. And so it does generate a lot of interest. Nietzsche is more popular while he is insane and unable to appreciate that he's popular than he ever was while he was lucid. But ultimately, I do think that this mystique gives a very misleading picture of who Nietzsche was and what he taught. Again, his philosophy was above all one of health, not sickness. One of truth, an ironclad belief in truth, not a philosophy of insanity. We can disagree with Nietzsche, of course, and his philosophy, but we can't really disagree that he was attempting to work out a philosophy of health and vitality. And so to the extent that his insanity gave him a reputation that was very different from that, I think it was unfounded. Before we move on, I want to tell you about the only supplement I take every single day. That is instantized creatine by Gains in Bulk. There are just more and more studies that come out every single day that demonstrate that creatine is one of the few supplements that you can trust to have a huge benefit, not just on muscle gain, that's what everyone knows it for, muscle gain, strength increase, and recovery, but also on mental performance, especially if you've had a poor night's sleep. Of course, you need to dial in your sleep. You need to get good sleep. This isn't a perfect substitute. However, if you do have a bad night's sleep, which I have all the time because I have 4 young children, then taking a few scoops of creatine really helps get you back to baseline and getting that mental clarity again so that you can think. So try it out. You will love it. And instantized creatine is the best kind because it is fully water soluble. That means it's easier to digest, easier to break down, and so you get more bang for your buck. You get less bloating and more benefit. So try it out. You will love it. Go to gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN for 15% off. I love Gains in Bulk. I think you'll love it too. So again, that is gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN. This episode is also brought to you by Founders. Founders is one of my favorite podcasts. It's like How to Take Over the World, but specifically for and about great founders of companies. The host, David Senra, is a good friend, and he does a remarkable job of connecting all these different stories of great founders and drawing out the best lessons that you can learn. So if you are not just a founder of a company, but anyone who's trying to start something new, I think that you can learn enormously from this podcast. I certainly do. It's one of the few podcasts that I listen to every single week. So check it out. That is Founders, wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so that is his senescence. That's his insanity. He dies in 1900. And really quickly, to put a bow on the cause of all this, people have tried to diagnose Nietzsche from afar. Did he have a stroke or an aneurysm? Did he have dementia? Did he have syphilis? And syphilis is one of the most common theories for why Nietzsche went mad and died, for one very simple reason. His examining doctor, when he was first admitted to an insane asylum, said he had neurosyphilis. All right, he puts that on the official medical report. And we also know that Nietzsche visited a brothel at least once when he was younger. He wrote of going there and feeling so awkward and out of place that he began playing the piano in the brothel. And we don't know if he got over his nervousness and actually got up from the piano and tested the wares. I think it's pretty safe to assume that he did. We also don't know if that was his only trip to a brothel or if he was a regular customer. Again, we just don't know, but we do know that at least once in his life, he went to a brothel. It's not unreasonable to assume he went multiple times. Okay. So he goes to a brothel early in life, gets syphilis, and dies of medically diagnosed neurosyphilis years later. Case closed, right? However, there are a few reasons to think otherwise. So first of all, let's establish what syphilis is like. You contract it usually through sexual contact. You get one small sore in the area where you contract it. Then a few weeks later, you get sick. You get more sores. It's pretty nasty, but then it goes away completely, or at least it's completely asymptomatic. You feel nothing. You think you're over this sickness. And then a number of years later, and it can be totally variable. It can be a decade. It can be multiple decades. It can be, 3 to 5 years. It just depends. But then you start getting bumps under your skin, some warts. It can affect your vision. But the main thing that happens is it attacks your brain and you go crazy and die. Now, in our day and age, syphilis is very treatable with antibiotics, but it was not at all in the 19th century. It was a death sentence. You contract syphilis, congratulations. You don't know how many years it's going to be, but eventually this is how you are going to die. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. So reasons to believe Nietzsche didn't die of syphilis. I already laid out the case for. Here's the case against. Number one, his decline in death happens way too slowly. The vast majority of patients die within 2 to 5 years of this resurgence. Once the syphilis returns, you're on the clock. You got 2 to 5 years. In very rare cases, that can stretch out to a decade. But Nietzsche, he dies 11 years after his complete, breakdown, and clearly he's starting to have some early symptoms for a couple years before that. And so, 13 years is sort of unheard of for eventual decline and death from syphilis. Additionally, yes, his doctor did write neurosyphilis on his intake form, but this was common shorthand for rapid onset insanity because the vast majority of people presenting rapid onset insanity did in fact have syphilis. So it's not like every single time they were going through, checking the symptoms, asking them questions, did you contract it earlier? This is the 1800s. Doctors often don't want to ask those kind of personal questions. So it seems unlikely that he was given a thorough exam to rule out other potential sources of the illness. It's just okay, rapid onset insanity, neurosyphilis. That's what we chalk it always up to. Additionally, another reason to think that it wasn't syphilis is Nietzsche was something of a hypochondriac. He is always writing about what foods are good for him, make him feel good, which ones imbalance his system, what air comports with his constitution, where he enjoys the water, where he doesn't, all that sort of thing. How much to walk. He was very sensitive to his body and the feelings that various phenomena caused in his body. And I just find it really difficult to believe that he would have contracted syphilis, experienced the telltale signs of early infection, and not written about it obsessively. And we have no mentions of it, not in letters to other people, not in his personal writing, and that's odd. And then, of course, the last piece of evidence is his father died from a similar brain condition. He also goes insane and dies, although for his father, it was both earlier in life and it happened. He has this rapid breakdown. He's insane for a very short amount of time, then he dies. But otherwise is very similar. So it seems to me much more likely that he died from some congenital brain condition. Maybe that's very early onset Alzheimer's. Maybe it is a genetic predisposition for bleeding in the brain, for getting aneurysms or suffering strokes. I don't know. But I do think he likely did not die of syphilis. He rather died from the same condition as his father. But okay, there you go. That's my argument. I think Nietzsche didn't die of syphilis. So that is the basic overview of the life of Nietzsche. From growing up to university student to follower of Schopenhauer to university professor to independent philosopher, going insane and then dying in 1900. But let's dive a little deeper into the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. So just to refresh your memory, God is dead. We have no purpose. Life is to suffer in the midst of a chaotic universe. And now the question is, how do you fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts? If we are not here to get to heaven, what is the purpose of mankind? And for Nietzsche, this is the superhuman, the ubermensch, the next evolution of mankind. Now, I should note at the outset that what Nietzsche meant by the ubermensch is hotly debated. And that is because at times, it sounds like he means for it to be the literal next evolution of man. In fact, most of the time. As he says explicitly, as man is to ape, so is the superhuman to man. He says in Thus Spake Zarathustra, what is an ape in the eyes of humanity? An occasion for laughter or smarting shame. And that is what the human will be for the superhuman, an occasion for laughter or smarting shame. The journey from worm to human lies behind you, and still there is much of the worm in you. At one time you were apes, and even now the human is more of an ape than any ape. Okay, so that to me seems pretty cut and dried. He also says man is a rope stretched between the animal and the superhuman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. And he even states explicitly that there never has been a superhuman. He says, never yet has there been a superhuman. I have seen both of them naked, the greatest and the lowliest human. They are still too similar to each other. Truly I found even the greatest all too human. Okay? So, some people think that this is a literal evolution, right? I think that, frankly. I think that's what Nietzsche meant. But some people think it's more of a mindset, that you can become a superhuman by following the philosophy of Nietzsche and by cultivating your own values and things like that. So I guess that begs the question, what is it explicitly that separates the superhuman from man? And it is everything, okay? Nietzsche believes in the cultivation of every positive attribute. The superhuman is healthier, more attractive, more intelligent, stronger. He is in every way better than man. However, the most important thing that the superhuman does is he determines new values, all right? Which is kind of funny, right? If you think about like, well, what's the difference between man and ape? You would say, well, we're more intelligent, we have better communication skills, we have language. So it seems like an odd departure. Why is it that the ability to determine new values would create the superhuman? You know, what an odd dimension on which to distinguish two species. There are two reasons for this, I think. The first is that God is who has given us values up to now. And now that he is dead, we need someone new to give us values. And Nietzsche makes this explicit in Thus Spake Zarathustra. He says, all the gods are dead. Now we want the superhuman to live. So he's stating explicitly, the superhuman is to take the place of the gods who are now dead. So on the one hand, the superhuman determines values because otherwise we are at a loss for values, for what gives us meaning. And then on the other hand, because this impulse to create values, to determine what is valuable, is an extension of what makes man noble to begin with. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, it is immediately obvious that designations of moral value were everywhere first applied to human beings and only later and derivatively to actions, which is why it is a grave error when moral historians start from such questions as why has the compassionate action been praised? The noble type of man feels himself to be determiner of values. Okay, again, the noble type of man feels himself to be the determiner of values. He does not need to be approved of. He judges what harms me is harmful in itself. He knows himself to be that which in general first accords honor to things. He creates values. Everything he knows to be part of himself, he honors. Such a morality is self-glorification. In the foreground stands the feeling of plenitude, of power which seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of a wealth which would like to give away and bestow. The noble human being too aids the unfortunate, but not, or almost not, from pity, but most from an urge begotten by superfluity of power. The noble human being honors in himself the man of power. Okay? So do you understand that now? There is a divine spark in man, or at least in the most noble of men. They feel honor for themselves. They feel it natural to judge what is good and what is bad. And there is a direct line from that instinct to God. And so by cultivating that instinct, By cultivating the highest specimens of man, Nietzsche wants to embark on a project lasting thousands of years at least to breed a species of gods. Okay? We cultivate that inherent self-centeredness, self-belief, that ability to judge and determine values. And by growing and growing it, we create a species of gods who is able to project that determination of values onto the world. Unless you think I overstate the case, here is Nietzsche, once again from Thus Spake Zarathustra. He says, God is a conjecture, but I want you to conjecture no further than the reach of your creative will. Could you create a god? Then spare me your talk of all these gods. But you could create the superhuman. Perhaps not you yourselves, my brothers, but you can remake yourselves into the fathers and ancestors of the superhuman. And that should be your finest act of creation. So literally wants to breed these superhumans, these supermen, to take the place of God. Okay, very explicit. That's our goal. We can't make ourselves superhumans, but we can make ourselves the ancestors of superhumans. He goes on to say that the superhuman is the meaning of the earth. This is the great project that he places before mankind. So many people want to boil down the ubermensch, the superhuman, to nothing more than the revaluation of all values, which is very important to Nietzsche, and it is sort of the defining characteristic of the superhuman. But people find it scary to talk about biological quality and eugenics. In our egalitarian age, we want to believe that everyone is capable of everything, that anyone can reevaluate their values and determine for themselves what they value and desire. And to a certain extent, Nietzsche believes that is true. But Nietzsche flips this on its head. We believe at our core that you are what you do. Our actions are what define us. That is what we believe in our egalitarian age. But Nietzsche says that you do what you are. He flips it around. Your actions do indeed define you, but only because they are an outward manifestation of what you truly are on the inside. And so if we would like to become something more than we are, it isn't enough to want it and try to be better. We can't get there through practice. We must get there through literal cultivation, by becoming more than we are. And we can only do that by breeding a higher type of man. And by the way, Nietzsche says that by doing this, we participate in culture. That is what culture is. If you think about the word culture, it's interesting, right? Because when we think of culture, what do you think of? You think of music, you think of art, you think of architecture. Maybe you think of clothing and dance, like all these things that separate one people from another. But the word culture, think about that root. Think about cultivation. Think about agriculture. Okay, horticulture. What is agriculture? It is the growing of crops. Okay, it is the practice of selectively breeding and creating life for a purpose. And that is what culture is, right? So it is still like that stuff, that art that goes into it, but only because that art praises a certain type of specimen. It makes moral valuations, both in its performance and in what it praises as art. So if you can think of music, okay, Wagner participates in culture, and Wagner, the type of Wagner is elevated because he is a great composer, and so that promotes people with a certain type of intelligence, with a certain type of vision and will, right? Everything that goes into composing and performing great music, certain hand-eye coordination, all that stuff, right? It promotes culture, it cultivates, it promotes certain attributes. Similarly, if you think of like painting, what is painting? You know, you go look at the work of the David, all right, of Michelangelo. It is culture because it cultivates a certain form of beauty in the human body. Certain proportions and strength and a certain look. Okay, so it might seem paradoxical that by trying to bring about the superhuman, we're participating in culture. How is it that that is what culture is? But there is this link between art and the promotion of certain attributes of certain types within society. So that's why Nietzsche says that by trying to create the superhuman, we participate in culture. Now, the next question that naturally arises is, what exactly does it mean to create new values? Okay, and Nietzsche never fully answers this, but he does have this great quote from The Gay Science that I think is a related phenomenon that can help shed some light on what that might mean. He says, "So what makes a person noble? Certainly not making sacrifices. Even those burning with lust make sacrifices. Certainly not following some passion, for there are contemptible passions. Certainly not that one does something for others without selfishness. Perhaps no one is more consistently selfish than the noble one. Rather, the passion that overcomes the noble one is a singularity, and he fails to realize this. The use of a rare and singular standard, and almost a madness, the feeling of heat in things that feel cold to everyone else, a hitting upon values for which the scale has not yet been invented, a sacrifice on altars made for an unknown God, a courage without any desire for honors, a self-sufficiency that overflows and communicates to men and things. Hitherto, then, it was rarity and the unawareness of this rarity that made noble. Note, however, that by means of this standard, everything usual, near, and indispensable, in short, that which most preserved the species, and in general, the rule of humanity hitherto, was inequitably judged, and on the whole slandered in favor of the exceptions, to become the advocate of the rule that might be the ultimate form and refinement in which noble-mindedness manifests itself on earth. Okay? End of quote. So the use of a rare and singular standard, the favor of exceptions, it does remind me of like the heathen or pagan pantheon, right? Where you have different gods with their particular attributes and their particular standards and specimens that they prefer. I still don't think that's a complete answer. I don't know that Nietzsche had the complete answer. I think it's very likely that he thought, well, I'm not the superhuman. I can't tell you what new values will look like. If I could, then I would be the superhuman. But I think he's gesturing vaguely in the direction of the valuations of pagan gods. It seems there is an aesthetic element to it as well. And in Nietzsche's conception, there is definitely a strong element of the artist in the superhuman. And so to Nietzsche, this is the meaning of the earth, to create the superhuman. Again, many people do not want to accept this conception of the superhuman. And why not? Because it is the most radically anti-liberal teaching in history. Think about what the creation of the superhuman would mean. Most of us have nothing to contribute genetically to the superhuman. A fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of all humans alive will see their genes survive long enough to make any sort of contribution whatsoever to the substrate of what will eventually go on to form this new species, the superhuman. The rest of us will go the way of Homo erectus, which is to say extinct. Or at best, maybe humans stick around, but at best we become like chimpanzees, maybe, maybe pets or playthings of the superhuman. But it's not a bright future for the majority of humanity. At best, we are worthless and maybe doomed. And this is just a continuation into the future of what Nietzsche believes about the present. So, for example, when we hear about aristocracies and they are being defended against socialists and liberals and reformers, some people want to do away with the aristocracy in England. Or people are against aristocracies of wealth in the United States. There should be no billionaires, things like that. And when people defend billionaires in the United States or lords and ladies in England, we mostly hear people say things like, well, yes, this might create inequality, but this serves the greater good, right? Aristocracies work to maintain continuity. They preserve beauty. Look at all these estates that are preserved in the United Kingdom. Their wealth goes to philanthropy, whatever. Our nation benefits from people who have a long-term stake in the economy. But Nietzsche actually just takes the opposite view. Aristocracies, the winners of society, their critics might be right, and probably are right, that they're completely predatory. They contribute almost nothing to the lower classes. But they are the material from which the ubermensch is going to be made, the superhuman. They are the healthy, the beautiful, the good, the type of life that justifies human existence. He says that a nation, an entire people, quote, is a detour of nature to get 6 or 7 great men. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, the essential thing in a good and healthy aristocracy is, however, that it does not feel itself to be a function of the monarchy or of the commonwealth, but as their meaning and supreme justification, that it therefore accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of innumerable men who for its sake have to be suppressed and reduced to imperfect men, to slaves and instruments. Its fundamental faith must be that society should not exist for the sake of society, but only as foundation and scaffolding upon which a select species of being is able to raise itself to its higher task, and in general, to a higher existence. Like those sun-seeking climbing plants of Java, they are named Sippomatador. That's kind of a random aside. Which clasp an oak tree with their tendrils so long and often that at last, high above it, but supported by it, they can unfold their crown in the open light and display their happiness. So this is a radically different conception on the purpose of society from what we usually hear. The aristocracy is not for everyone else. Everyone else is for the aristocracy. That's the only reason we exist, is to promote these higher types that can elevate the peak experience of mankind. And that's how we bring about the superhuman. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is not a prophecy. This is not inevitable. When Nietzsche declares that God is dead, he also wants to root out anything that tries to sneak God in the back door. That includes something like Marxism, with his long march of history. Marx and his followers believe that history has an endpoint, that the revolution is coming. Heaven, the workers' paradise, is at the end of the road. History has a destination. Marxism does away with God, but it gives a person all those same calm assurances that everything is going to work out. So it might say that it doesn't have a God, but it sneaks God in the back door with its belief in the inevitable march of history. But Nietzsche wants to do away with that. We don't get any comfort that, yes, humanity is in a tight spot, but the superhuman will definitely come. Don't worry, just hang on, history has a goal, everything will work out. No, the universe is chaotic, things might not work out. And so there is another vision that he paints, different from the superhuman, and he calls it the last man. Okay, the last man lives a life of jealousy, envy, and what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. Okay, ressentiment is similar to the more common word resentment, but ressentiment or ressentiment literally means re-sentiment, to re-feel. It's a feeling of resentment, but there is a component of rumination as well. You can't stop resenting. All right, you can think of like the feeling when I can tell you, I had some resentiment just like the other week. I lost a tennis match. And just for days, I could not stop thinking. I kept re-feeling that feeling of losing that tennis match. Right? I couldn't stop ruminating on it and thinking about it. You can think of the scene from the TV show Mad Men, where Don Draper is fighting with his self-righteous colleague, and the argument culminates in the young colleague saying, "I feel bad for you." And Don Draper retorts, "I don't think about you at all." Okay? That guy is clearly feeling ressentiment. He can't stop feeling this. It's not just that he has resentment towards Don Draper's success, but he can't stop feeling and re-feeling that resentment. Okay, so above all, the last man feels resentment. He hates distinction. He hates the remarkable. Is suspicious of that which is different, especially of that which is exceptional. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes of the age of the last man. He says, everyone wants the same. Everyone is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into the madhouse. Okay? That is the picture of the future without the superhuman. Okay? Of the future of the last man. Everyone's the same. Everyone thinks the same. If you happen to think differently, you're so aghast at yourself that you voluntarily check yourself into the madhouse. Okay? The last man wants nothing great. He just wants to be comfortable and cozy. He says they have their little pleasure for the day, their little pleasure for the night, but they honor health, right? No great projects, nothing exceptional. And in fact, the last man rules on earth. Nietzsche thinks that we sort of are on a path that way. And so this is the battle that Nietzsche sets before us. On the one hand, progress, the ubermensch, the superman, man become God. Beautiful, intelligent, noble, determining values, and embarking on great projects that would be unimaginable to mere humans. And on the other hand, the last man letting his envy get the best of him until we devolve into a dull-eyed species of herd animals. Now, as you will recall from episode 1, Nietzsche did not believe in objective morality. So again, we are confronted with the question of, okay, well, maybe I prefer comfort and coziness and equality. Maybe I don't care if man evolves and becomes a god and affirms life. Morality is just a preference, isn't it? So, okay, I prefer the last man. And we saw a little bit of Nietzsche's answer last time. He acknowledges his own hypocrisy a bit and calls it in good taste, all right? He says, it's in good taste to have just a little bit of hypocrisy. But his more logically and philosophically sound answer is another one of his most famous ideas, and that is the will to power. When you hear will to power, you think you know what it means. The desire to become more powerful, right? Just like pretty cut and dried. And that isn't incorrect. That is will to power. But Nietzsche thought that this impulse or instinct was much bigger than that. Nietzsche believed that the will to power was the origin and the meaning of all life. Okay? All life can be distilled down to will to power. And you might think, like, no, not like all life, but yes, all life. Okay? He did not believe in Darwinian evolution. He believed that will to power was a better explanation for life and how it evolves. Okay? So let me try to explain this. And let me first start by saying that this is one of his most difficult doctrines, and I really had a hard time wrapping my head around it. I think I get the death of God, the genealogy of morals, beyond good and evil, the ubermensch, the last man, all that I think makes sense to me. I think I understand Nietzsche. But will to power, not so much. But let me explain to the best of my ability what I think is happening, okay? So Nietzsche calls the will to power the unexhausted, procreating life will. And he contrasts it with the Darwinian will to existence, which he thinks is misguided. Okay, here from Thus Spake Zarathustra, he writes, "Whoever shot the phrase will to existence at the truth missed the mark. For that will does not exist. For what does not exist cannot exert a will. But how could what already exists wish to come into being? Only where there is life is there also a will. However, not the will to life, but, this is my teaching to you, the will to power." Okay, so he says that will to existence cannot come from non-existence. So it can't explain the origin of life. However, I do fail to see how this does not also apply to power, okay? Because something that does not exist also doesn't have any power. So how could will to power come from non-power? It seems like the same problem to me. And here's what H.L. Mencken, in his biography, says of this. He says, "Nevertheless, in a moment of sophistry later in life, he undertook to criticize the law of natural selection and even to deny its effects. It is sufficient to say, in answer, that the law itself is inassailable, and that all of Nietzsche's work, saving this single unaccountable paragraph, helps support it. His frequent sneers at Darwin in other places need not be taken too seriously. Everything English toward the close of his life excited his ire. But the fact remains that he was a thorough Darwinian, and that without Darwin's work, his own philosophy would have been impossible." I think that there's a lot of truth to that actually Nietzsche's philosophy comports quite well with Darwin, and he did hate the English. In the endnotes, I'll read some funny quotes on that. However, I do think that there is something more interesting here too. I'm not quite as dismissive as Mencken is, and here's why. Life is not necessarily trying to survive, right? Ask any Darwinian and they will tell you that same thing. But everyone agrees on that. Life that is fit does survive and replicate, but that doesn't mean that that is what it is trying to do, right? The white butterfly that survives because it blends in with the white bark of a tree contributes to the process of evolution, or at least of natural selection, but that's not what it was trying to do, right? It wasn't trying to survive. It just was born with white wings. And that contributed to its survival, right? You would like to survive, of course. You don't want to die, but you don't spend every second of every day thinking about survival. Only life in the most desperate circumstances thinks that way. So is there a unifying principle that does explain the will, the intention of all life? And Nietzsche says that yes, it is the will to power. And that actually does make some sense, right? Because evolutionarily speaking, you actually don't know what circumstances will arise. You don't have a perfect knowledge of what will help you survive and what will not. But what you do know is that having power, being the master of your circumstances, being able to control your surroundings, will always be helpful to that end. And so from a Darwinian perspective, perhaps you could say that natural selection does take place, but that life, not knowing exactly what to do in order to survive and reproduce, actually wills power, not survival and reproduction. If you wanted to take it a step further, I am actually a Darwinian evolution skeptic, and not necessarily for religious reasons even, but when you really dig into it and look at the data, natural selection is a very well observed phenomenon. We can measure it, we can see it happening. Okay, natural selection occurs. And that is one pillar of Darwinian evolution. But the other pillar is a random mutation. That random changes happen in the genetic code, and this is the source of variation that nature selects from. And random mutation is a much more dubious proposition. And one reason for that is the data just doesn't add up. Like, there isn't enough time for life to have evolved to the complexity and diversity that it has in the current day solely through random mutation. And the other thing is that it is very, very difficult to add useful data through random change. Like, think about a book, okay? A book that got endlessly copied, okay? Copies and copies and copies of this book. And each time it gets copied, there were a few small random additions and deletions to the book. And the best versions of the book are the ones that are then used to reproduce the next generation of copies of the book. Well, it is going to be very, very difficult to add to the story, to make the book better by randomly adding one word at a time. And somehow that one word has to at least not be deleterious. It can't be like end of sentence and that's it. It has to go with the flow of the book somehow, or at least, you can look over it, it smuggles its way in, and then another word, and slowly this forms a sentence, and then a paragraph, and then a chapter. Okay? That will almost never happen. What you might get is a book that gets slightly, very slightly better by getting shorter, right? You could see how, we forgot a sentence, but actually, the book is better without that sentence, or better without that word, okay? And over time, the book might become more brief, might lose data, and become a tiny bit better in that way. And it's true, actually, that when you look at it, when we observe evolution as it happens in real time, what we mostly see is information loss. Okay, so if you look at bears, a brown bear becomes a polar bear by losing melanin in its fur. That evolutionary step happened quite quickly because it represented information loss. But it would be very difficult for a group of polar bears to evolve back into brown bears because melanin production takes a new process and therefore new information in the genetic code. And sure enough, we find in the fossil record that polar bears evolved from brown bears and not vice versa. And this happened via information loss in the genetic code, which is much, much more common. Okay. Man, I hope you guys find this interesting. This is quite the detour. So then where does all this complexity in life come from? How does life go from a single cell amoeba to whales and spiders and humans and redwood trees, right? Well, random mutation survives as the working theory because no one has proposed a better working theory. And I think that will to power as a substitute for random mutation is an interesting idea. The problem is I don't know what that actually means in practice, like how that shakes out. I can explain to you how random mutation works, and that's why everyone accepts it. It's like the only theory we have. And will to power is an interesting idea, but I don't think Nietzsche knows what that actually means. I don't know what that actually means. If you think you know what it means, explain it to me. Okay, here's what Nietzsche says about it. He says, physiologists should think again before postulating the drive to self-preservation as the cardinal drive in an organic being. A living thing desires above all to vent its strength. Life as such is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent consequences of it. In short, here as everywhere, beware of superfluous teleological principles, such as is the drive to self-preservation. All right. Anyway, whether or not will to power is the answer to why all of life exists, why it gets more complex, why it drives upwards rather than downwards, it is Nietzsche's answer to why the superhuman is better than the last man, why master morality is better than slave morality. Because they foster, cultivate, encourage the will to power, this life-giving force. And therefore, it is still just a preference, and there still is no objective right and wrong, but at least the superhuman and master morality have the weight of life on their side. They are they're pro-life. Yeah, they're good Republicans. No, I don't mean it in that way, but they are in favor of life. Again, is it an objective measure of why it's better? No, but the weight of life, I think, counts for something in the accounting of which is preferable. Okay. So I hope the whole system of Nietzsche's thought is coming together for you. God is dead. We have to find new meaning. Where once we saw good and evil in the universe, we now see things as they really are. We see only will to power. Will to power is the will to life. Okay, life is the will to power, in other words. And therefore, we ought to celebrate and affirm those higher specimens that most strongly exhibit will to power. And what are those higher specimens? They are those which are distinguished for their complexity and intelligence and independence. The ultimate expression, the end result of this process, is the creation of the superhuman. Man evolved into God. The superhuman will be better in every way, and importantly, he will have the capacity to create new values and to give new meaning to mankind. The opposite result, if man chooses the other way, is the last man, the small, grasping, desperate, resentful product of envy and comfort, of the rejection of the will to power, the rejection of life. He wants everyone and everything to be equal, and this results in man stagnating and eventually declining, devolving into human form once more. Master morality is a way of describing the world that is natural to men and women of strong wills. It elevates the good, the healthy, the brave, the beautiful. Slave morality is a way of describing the world that comes naturally to those who are low in will, who seek to bring down and bind higher specimens so that they will not be a threat. And Christianity is the ultimate expression of slave morality on earth. Ta-da, there you go. There is Nietzsche in as short a summary as I can give it. The one thing that we still have not discussed is the problem of suffering. I brought that up in episode 1. The fact that there is more suffering than joy in the world, right? A lion does not enjoy killing a gazelle nearly as much as a gazelle suffers while being eaten. Life in general is like a suffering production machine, okay? When we suffer enormously. And when we feel joy, it is fleeting. So we will discuss that next episode with the idea of eternal recurrence. That is Nietzsche's response to the problem of suffering. But for now, let's discuss some takeaways. Number 1, Nietzsche talks time and time again about how truly great free-thinking philosophers need solitude. From Thus Spake Zarathustra, he says, "You solitaries of today, you who withdraw, the time will come when you shall be a people. From you, who have chosen yourselves, a chosen people shall arise, and from among them, the superhuman." Okay? So to him, the solitary, independent man is actually the higher man, and it is the type that points the way toward the superhuman. He actually cautioned against reading too much. Okay? You can't think well and think independently when your mind is constantly being filled with thoughts from others. And obviously, I'm a big reading guy. I read a lot. It is a big part of not just my life, but my job, right? But I have to admit, I think he's right. Especially today, it is so easy to be listening to a podcast or an audiobook at all times, to be reading all the time. But we need to clear time to think for ourselves, and a lot of time. I think Nietzsche is right, that we actually need more time for thinking independently than we do consuming the thoughts of others. So that's a big wake-up call for me. That's my first takeaway, is give yourself time to think independently. Number 2, take a second look at will to power in your own life. Most people are not going to be willing to go all the way with Nietzsche. They will want to carve out some part of their heart for pity and what I would call Christian charity, right? Love of one's neighbor. But at the very least, I think Nietzsche demonstrates quite well that you should give your will to power enough rein that it at least serves as a check, as a balance towards those other impulses. Okay? So do not, I think Nietzsche is right about this, do not completely sublimate your will to power. It needs to be given a healthy place in your life. My third takeaway is that we're not thinking big enough. I don't know anyone who is thinking about undertaking a project so audacious that it alters the course of the world and takes millennia to complete and breeds a new species. Okay? And here's what Nietzsche says about it in The Gay Science. He says, "The strength to build is now paralyzed. The courage to make far-reaching plans is discouraged. The organizational geniuses become scarce. Who still dares to undertake works that would require millennia to complete? For what is dying out is that fundamental faith on the basis of which someone could calculate, promise, anticipate the future in a plan on that grand scale, and sacrifice the future to his plan. Namely, the basic faith that man has worth and sense only insofar as he is a stone in a great edifice. To this end, he must be firm above all else." Okay? How about that? Let's have the strength, the patience, the belief, the firmness to take over the world, right? You can see why I like his philosophy. To embark on great projects that will take thousands of years to complete. Yes, I believe this. And however big you're thinking, it's probably not that big. And, from that Caesar episode, you'll recall that the author of Caesar, A Life, whose name is Froude, writes that great men do not take on great and visionary projects, but take on missions that seem obvious to them as they arise in the present. And Caesar becomes Caesar not by wanting to be Caesar, but by tackling the next logical thing, right? And those might seem contradictory, but I don't think so. I think that by thinking independently, reevaluating our values, and finding what really is important to us, what we really truly value within ourselves, by, as Nietzsche puts it, becoming who we truly are, I think then what we see both in the immediate sense, what we should dedicate our life to. We find a vocation. We find the proper way to live. And then if you simply take that idea and extend it into the infinite, into eternity, then we can also project forward these great projects. Like Froude says that Caesar did not have lofty aims, but did the next logical thing. Yeah, on a certain extent that's true, but I think he did have lofty projects because he could see where those immediate projects led. And by thinking far in advance, he created something great. So yes, I believe this. Embark on great projects that will take thousands of years to complete. That is my hope for myself and for you. Okay, thank you for listening. If you are a premium subscriber, I have some more notes that I think you will enjoy. We're going to talk about the history of Nietzscheanism in the United States and his waxing and waning popularity, plus much more. So if you'd like to hear all that, you can subscribe at takeoverpod.supercast.com. If not, if you're tuning out now, thank you for listening to How to Take Over the World. Nietzsche said never to trust a thought that you have indoors. And so I did a lot of the reading for this episode outside. And I did that using text-to-speech through Speechify. I would just throw a book by Nietzsche into Speechify, and I would go for a walk up the canyon by my house, and I would listen to The Gay Science or Beyond Good and Evil or The Genealogy of Morals while I walked. Speechify is great. If you love learning, you will love Speechify. You retain a lot more and get through material faster if you listen and read it at the same time. And so Speechify can turn anything into a podcast. It can help you learn much faster. Check them out at Speechify.com and use code BEN for 20% off Speechify Premium. You won't regret it. I love Speechify. I think you will too. Again, that's Speechify.com and use code BEN.